Burn Pit 360, a local veterans group advocating for those suffering from deployment related to toxic exposures, now happy with new legislation that was passed this month. The National Defense Authorization Act for 2020 adds provisions to create a plan ending the use of burn pits and providing a list where burn pits have been used during wartime. Rosie Torres, the executive director of Burn Pit 360, says this legislation is the first step in making it easier for veterans exposed to toxins from burn pits to get some extra much needed help.
Presumptive would mean that you wouldn't have to prove that you were around a burn pit or the burn pit caused sort of exactly what happened with Agent Orange, right? After 20 years, they established a list of presumptives, illnesses that were a result of wartime injuries.
Burn Pit 360 will return to Washington, D.C. January 17th to work with other veteran organizations to get more support for veterans from President Trump. For details on how you can help or for more information, just visit our website, KIITV.com.